Thank you guys for coming today. We're really excited about the panel discussion today. Um, so we meet, this, this program happens every quarter. We usually meet between like all the staff to look through the survey results from our residents and fellows for this year, to go through what they want to talk about. And when we originally met about this back in December to figure out what we wanted to talk about, getting over a cold, sorry. It felt really like the right time right now to talk about like censorship within art spaces across mediums. So that led to the conversation that we're having today. I'm really pleased to introduce you to Romana, our facilitator for today. Romana is our Sheldon Ortiz Fellow for 2024. She is also the founding director and curator of the Chenla Lee Legacy Project, which she founded in March 2021 as a homage to her late father, Chenla Lee, a pioneering Asian immigrant artist, printmaker, and professor, and has also done a million other things. So I will leave you with Romana. And also the other thing I want to tell you guys about is there are these postcards on the desk back there. That is part of our April residency project in our second floor gallery space by Yana Larrabee. Please fill these out and mail them back to Yannick, and it'll become a part of his exhibition called Address in the Future. And he is trying to tap into as many Philadelphians as possible about what their vision for a sustainable future could look like. So thank you, and thank you, Romana.
Yeah. Thanks, Sam. Hi, everyone. Welcome into this space. It's great to be with you for this conversation, which I think is incredibly timely and important. So we're glad that you're here, and I see some of my fellow fellows coming into this space. And I want to talk a little bit about Sam explains who I am, but I want to talk about how I come into this space. Today we're talking about censorship, and my father was a political refugee who fled communist China because he was an educator, he was an artist. And so it was important for him to be able to live out his life purpose in freedom and all forms of creativity. And that's why he left his country and came eventually to the United States. And so for me, and the way that I was raised and the values that I was raised with was really around freedom of expression, and to be able to have that privilege to be able to do that. I think we find ourselves in a time in the world where that has become, well, we know historically, right? We're going to talk a little bit about that today, what censorship has looked like. But I think in this moment, right? As our world has become more turbulent and our grasp on democracy, I think, has become a bit more fragile. I think we really grapple with what it means to have voice, what it means to be empowered. And so today's conversation will be focused on arts and how we as artists can hold on to that and what that looks like in our practices. So I have two esteemed colleagues with me here today, Leila Delicious and Kara Mshinda. Leila Delicious uses she, her pronouns, is a Palestinian burlesque performer and performance artist based in Philadelphia. Her work exists at the epicenter of queer Palestinian decadence. Leila began her performing career as a political performance artist and sees burlesque as a continuation of that work. Her burlesque work of performing Palestinian past, present, and future has now become a ritual of embodied decolonization. Leila has performed around the country, including as a finalist in the Philadelphia Burlesque Battle Royale Season 10. She's performed in festivals such as Cannonball and Burlesque and Beyond. And Kara Mshinda, she, her, hers, is a visual anthropologist based in the Philadelphia area. Kara is best known for using collage, print media, and lo-fi photography to develop visual narratives about identity, place, memory, and ephemera in daily life. Her current work, All Hands Hold, is a visual study and photoethnography about human hands in social encounters and self-identity. She is a co-founder and collaborator of Griot Arts, an atelier that focuses on building community via process-based art education. In addition to practicing art, Kara is an adjunct faculty member at Tyler School of Art and Architecture, where she teaches an art history course on race, identity, and art practices in the Americas. So before we jump into my first question for y'all, I want to direct everyone to this little piece of paper that is on your chair or somewhere near you. You know, today's conversation, it could be potentially charged, right? We're talking about politics, and as we know, it can be challenging, and so we want to make sure that we're in agreement of how we want to show up in this space. And so we have discussion guidelines for today's conversation, and I'll just start by reading them. And actually, maybe we can each take one and go around the room, so I'm not reading the whole list. So first, be an active listener. Seek to understand. Pay attention to your and others' body language. Sam, you want to go?
Be open to different perspectives and respect opinions whether you agree or not.
Make space for all voices to be heard.
It's great to ask questions.
Don't talk over or interrupt people. Wait your turn to speak.
Be mindful of others' ethnic background, religion, and beliefs.
Respect others' boundaries and personal space.
Offer content warnings for discussing potentially violent or explicit content, visual or otherwise.
Avoid using offensive language.
We encourage taking notes on others' comments to remember for later discussion.
Intention is important and your impact is everything. Be open to new information, keep a learner's mindset.
So that was so perfect. There's one meant to be. Is there any other agreement that folks would want to add to this existing list that is not already here? We're good? Okay, wonderful. All right. So I want to turn to our panelists and ask the first question just to open up the conversation, and then we're going to do a group activity. So this is our foray into the conversation. So I'll start with you, Leila, and then I'll go to you, Kara. What was about this conversation that drew you in? Why did you think it was important for you to be part of this conversation today?
Yeah, so as a Palestinian burlesque artist, or as a Palestinian artist in general, I think like censorship is something that we're very, very familiar with. And a lot of the symbols that have been created that we identify with Palestine, such as the watermelon, are things that were created through censorship and through navigating censorship. And I recently had like a real experience of like artist censorship where I performed around the city for the past like 2 years as a burlesque performer. And then post October 7th, started making work that was, I always created work that included these symbols like watermelon and olives and olive oil. And there was a venue that I performed at quite a bit. And then I showed up to the venue with a sign that was part of my act that said, "Our generation will free Palestine," and wasn't allowed to come in and was banned from the venue for like showing up for my gig. And that kind of woke up a lot of the nightlife community around like we need to be intentional about how we're speaking about Palestine and how we are including Palestinian artists in the conversation and in the shows that we create in the city. So I think I have like a more recent brush with artist censorship that like is relevant in this time, and then also the history of Palestinian art and Palestinian performance is so filled with censorship, and like the ways that we have navigated around that and built from that, I think has made Palestinian artwork and Palestinian performance what it is today. So I'm very honored to come from a place where my work is a continuation of that resistance of censorship.
Thank you. So powerful. Yeah. Kara, what about you? What brought you here into this conversation today?
Yeah, so my connection to censorship in art and also talking about political art is really, it came from teaching. And in particular art history. So I'm really fascinated with how which works are elevated in the Western canon or any canon, and which ones are omitted. And I think I'm interested in that because a lot of my own work deals with identity. And I really think that it's something I've been thinking about for a while is that censorship is not just about, it has to do with, well, let me say this, censorship is about power and who has power over visibility and control of imagery. And we seldom ask the question, like, who has the power to censor these, these types of artworks? And I'm also interested too in what history can teach us about, trends in censoring art. Most of my knowledge about censorship really comes from studying the culture wars of the 1980s, in particular with LGBTQ identity and the AIDS epidemic, and how many artists during that time, some of which I might mention a little bit later, had their work censored or had their exhibitions closed because of the content. And so I'm also really interested, and what brought me into this conversation too, is because of what is happening right now in the world, in particular, what's happening in Gaza. And I'm really here too because I want to be a little bit more informed about it and to hear other people's thoughts. So that's what brought me here. Yeah.
Thank you both. All right. So we're going to turn to all of you. We're going to do a little bit of a group activity. So on your chair, you have a Post-it note and a colored pencil. So if you're familiar with the word cloud concept, that's what you're going to endeavor to do right now as we define, right, what we're talking about. What does censorship mean? What do we think of when we hear that word censorship? Okay, so you can use this Post-it to write down your thoughts. What pops up for you when you think of censorship? What does that mean for you? All right, so take a minute to do that. And then we'll invite you when you're ready to come to the front and post it up on this board right here.
There are more Post-its here in front of other. And Daniel. Do you want to participate in that?
Yeah, come on up. Yeah, watch the board, but we'll get some motion here. Anyone else? It's not on yet. Okay, are you done? Take your time. You know, it's fine. All right. I'm gonna do my best to share all of these back. Maybe just have everybody share it all. Anyway, okay, imposing silence, control, power, controlling narratives and frames, abuse of power, fear of free speech, political reasons, concerns, to intimidate and cause one to be afraid, erasure of the other, not allowing all voices to be seen and heard in public spaces, being reprimanded for saying or creating something, but also being discouraged from saying and creating something for its perceived non-conformity to traditional values. Stifling, policing, attention, economy. Silence equals death, surveillance, legislation. Censor our work, covering up to avoid danger, straight hair, accent change, disguising deniance, religion fundamentalism. Censorship is lack of agency over narrative, control, thievery of history, identity and existence, leads to ignorance and echo chambers, anti-empathy. I love what Leila said about some Palestinian symbols stemming from censorship, needing to exist more secretly to escape the monitoring. Reminds me of this quote, the over archive.
Sorry, my handwriting's so bad.
Yeah.
The quote's the queer archive exists outside the margins. Yeah, I wrote so small. And just think about like the interconnected nature of like struggle under power.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much. The queer archive exists outside the margins. Yeah, and the interconnected nature of struggle. Beautiful. Great. I think we're ready to have our conversation now. Yeah, maybe lots of wonderful contributions. So history, I talked a lot about at the beginning, coming into this space of just my family's history, and I think that in the case of the Cultural Revolution that my father completely bypassed, that was a case of government censorship, right? And we're fortunate enough to live in a democracy that is not perfect. And so we still continue to, here, at least in the US, to wrestle with what it means to still be silenced in the midst of what our ideal should be, that everyone has voice, everyone has agency. And we're here to talk about how that plays out, because obviously it does. So the question, to the group that I will pose to our panelists is, what has history taught us about when art has been censored? And what can we learn from the past? Whoever would like to start in on that.
Yeah, I'm gathering my thoughts there. I feel like, and I could be underinformed about this history, but again, most of my understanding about censorship and art is really, as I said before, in the 80s. But before that, I'm really fascinated by art movements and how they come to be. And it really starts with kind of this idea of self-determination in the arts in the 60s and 70s, where artists started to become more political in their artwork. They were influenced by the civil rights movement, also feminist movements that were happening, environmentalism, and we get to like the 80s and we see what are called culture wars, right? We're constantly in culture wars. Those are usually topics that are very polarized in society, that can range anything to like reproductive rights, gun rights, you get the idea, right? I think what can history teach us is that, I think someone wrote about like when artists start to push quote unquote the traditional values of something, or something that hasn't been seen before, or makes people uncomfortable, or pushes the status quo, there appears to be an uptick in the erasure or the censoring of artworks in particular. And that's what happened in the 80s. I'm thinking here of, as you mentioned, you said your father experienced censorship by the government, right? All right, so artists like David Wojnarowicz, Andre Serrano, who else? Robert Mapplethorpe, all had their work censored because they were receiving federal grant money. The National Endowment of the Arts, for example, funded exhibitions for those three artists. And at the time there was, I think it was like Jesse Helms, and I have it in my notes, but there were some politicians who developed something called the American Family Association, and basically rallied support to have funds withdrawn from each of these artists' exhibitions as a result. And also the type of artwork that was being censored were depictions of, queer identity and queer experiences. And I don't know what I was going to go with that, but just saying that I think there's definitely a trend in where artists, I think, are at the forefront of this discussion, because they're the ones who kind of push the boundaries, right, through just creative practice. And I'm not sure what else I was going to say about that, but it just seems like, ever since, like, I would say the 80s, but even like, I'm kind of going off on a tangent, but I thought I saw an image. So these are some images that we all kind of put together. But even with Picasso's work, though, right? Guernica, that was considered like one of the, first kind of political like artworks, or an artwork that was making a statement. So I think there are so many examples from history that we can draw on of when artists' work is being censored.
Yeah. I think for me personally, like drawing from, as I said, Palestinian artists, and also burlesque, the history in burlesque and burlesque artists, I think what these two histories have taught me personally, and how that has influenced my work, is that censorship is inevitable. and getting creative and getting a little sneaky is always helpful. And also that to have reliance on your community, that they will see when work is being censored and when something is important is being stifled, and to uplift that. So just to talk a little bit, because I think everyone kind of has the understanding of like the watermelon and how it's the same colors as the Palestinian flag, but I don't think people fully understand the history behind that, because the Palestinian flag itself has been banned in Palestine several times. And there was a art gallery in Ramallah that had 3 artists. Their names were Nabil Hanani, Sliman Mansour, and Hissam Badr. And in the 1980s, they were creating a lot of paintings that had watermelon. So they were the first artists to kind of exhibit a showcase that had paintings of Palestinian culture, like tatriz, our cross-stitch fabric that we use in a lot of our clothing, and embedding watermelons throughout the paintings. And during the opening of that exhibit, Israeli Defense Forces came in and confiscated all of the paintings and arrested those 3 artists. And there's like a conversation that was had in the prison when they were being interrogated, where the artists were like, if I paint flowers with those colors, like trying to like kind of negotiate, I guess, for lack of a better word, of like, what can we use? Can we paint anything with these colors, and will you still confiscate it? And those paintings were never given back to those artists, and that the gallery was closed down. But the people of Ramallah, of that town, knew that this was happening, and immediately, within 2 weeks, people were on the streets carrying watermelons in protest, because they knew that they couldn't carry their flags anymore. So then watermelons started appearing everywhere. And then people were getting arrested for holding watermelons in Palestine, which is still the case. And there's also a lot of history around farmers in Palestine who are farming like a lot of our crops, like watermelon, olives, not being able to access that land. So that also has its own significance of Palestinian watermelon not being something that is deeply a part of our cuisine and our culture, and us not being able to sustain ourselves and our agriculture through accessing that land, having to go through checkpoints, not having the apartheid wall blocking farmers off from their own land, etc. So I don't think that people like fully understand that this is like how the watermelon came to be, and I think is really like a very important moment in Palestinian art censorship, where the Palestinian people like saw this and immediately picked it up and were suddenly carrying watermelons everywhere. And I think also there's a big history of censoring Palestinian performance and performance art in this country. It comes about as through the funding level, right? It's very, very difficult as a Palestinian artist to get your work funded. And that's why I perform at bars for the most part. And that kind of goes throughout burlesque history, right? Because there's such a strong presence of queer people of color, queer Black women performing burlesque, and in spaces that they weren't able to perform anywhere else. We couldn't perform in theaters, right? Bars and like these, like the diviest, dingiest, like hole in the wall environments are like where burlesque was born. So I think that also is like really inspiring to see how burlesque is a form that was created in these spaces, and like burlesque performers have histories of getting arrested, and there's a Burlesque Hall of Fame conference that happens every year in Las Vegas, and like older burlesque stars like share their stories of getting arrested for doing like lewd things, like, you know, political burlesque, and then also just being naked in different spaces, which is always fun to hear. And then there's also I think the Freedom Theater in Jenin is also a really interesting part of like Palestinian art censorship, because it had started in 2001, and since then there have been multiple instances of the Israeli forces like totally obliterating the theater, arresting the artistic directors. The founder was assassinated in 2006. And then recently, this past December, there was another like uprising of that, where the entire theater was just like completely trashed. And the artistic directors were arrested and tortured. And so, and there are like interviews of these artistic directors like talking about the investigation process and the interrogation process that they had to go through when they were arrested. And it's again kind of like a similar situation of them questioning like, what have I done wrong? You know, just to kind of see what they're going to say. And I think it's like performance in particular, I think can be very, very dangerous for a country like Israel that demands a definition of the past, present, and future. And performance, and I mean art in general, invites the artist to reimagine what the present could look like and imagine different realities and project what could exist in the future. And this is incredibly, incredibly dangerous for Israel that like really, really has a very clear definition of what the past, present, and future should be of Israel and has been. And I think that's why locations like the Freedom Theater in Jenin have been like continuously attacked. And again, there are lots of ways that like Palestinian theaters get like a little creative. Like, I don't know if you guys have heard of the Gaza monologues, but there was a theater in Gaza that had like teenagers write monologues just about their experiences in Gaza growing up, an instance that like shaped their identity. And since October 7th, this theater has demanded that theaters across the US and across the world hold performances of these Gaza monologues. This happened in Philly at the Leah Stein Theater. And so I think it's also a trust that the right people will see when art is being censored and will pick it up. And that you cannot possibly limit where stories go and where experiences are shared. And I think, obviously, since October 7th, so many terrible things have happened. But like one thing that I think all Palestinians can recognize is like how powerful the retelling of stories has been in our culture, especially like when the attack on Palestine is the Palestinian identity, right? So to perform as a Palestinian artist, to be a Palestinian person in the world, just not speaking, not talking, but just existing, is to resist the state of Israel. So I think that has been really important to recognize, and also, again, like the retelling of those stories. And I think also, just to like add quickly, there's been an intense history of silencing queer Palestinians and queer Palestinian artists that I think burlesque has given me a really unique way of addressing it within Palestine, whether it's the West Bank or Gaza. Queer Palestinians are constantly under threat of being outed if they aren't moles for the Israeli government. Like, they often get kidnapped and tortured and then told that like, we're going to tell everyone in your family and all of your friends and everyone that you're queer if you don't work with us and don't give us intel on your community. So, and this has been a tool that they've used against queer Palestinian artists as well. So I think, burlesque gives me and I have like it's strange to say that I have like the privilege in this country to like create that work when my work is also being censored. But I think again, like these bar environments, these like nightclub spaces that I perform in are very, I don't want to say casual because I feel like so much magic happens within these spaces, but I think gives people the opportunity to create something powerful. And also for the audience and sometimes the producers and like the people and the bartenders and the servers to not know what something is until after it's over and be like, oh, that's what we just experienced. And like, some people might be like, well, if I had known that that's what I was going to experience, I maybe wouldn't have come, or I maybe wouldn't have let that person come in to perform, but it's over in 5 minutes, so they can't really do anything about that. So I think like all of these elements of like Palestinian art and Palestinian art history and burlesque history have like kind of created a weird little container for me to create the things that I create, and have very much affected how I move through the world.
Yeah. I want to come back to, and this question is not on our pre-question, so but let's go with it. Kara, you've talked about identity, right? And this how identity plays into what artists create. And Leila, you talked about this too, as being a Palestinian person and an artist, and that identity of being under attack. And so I want to bring into this conversation of at what point is it possible, or what happens if an artist mutes their identity to stay safe and functioning in a world, and what choices that artists might need to kind of embrace to fully be able to move forward with bravery? Like what do you think folks are really grappling with, and what are the kind of some of the costs and benefits of leaning into one way or another? And do we have those choices?
That's a good question. I personally haven't had any of my artwork censored, but from my own personal experience, I've done a lot of self-censoring of my work. Like there's work that no one will ever see because I'm like, because of like, there's fears of repercussion. What would my family think? What would, how will it be received? These are all kind of like questions that we ask ourselves anyway as artists sometimes. At least I do. So I don't know. I don't know. I really am just kind of caught up now in this idea of like the type of self-censoring that artists can do sometimes. Like I have a whole like body of work on like nude self-portraits that I just have no one will ever see them. So it's yeah, I think there's real fear. And I think especially for artists who are brave enough to show their work, there's a fear of violence, being attacked, not having any galleries show your work. There's lots of repercussions to it. And again, it's usually artists who are oftentimes under-recognized or underrepresented in the art world who, experience, these kinds of, who have their work censored or do a lot of self-censoring. So,
Yeah. And I think we've seen a lot of what can happen when artists take stances with various movements. Like I think over the past like 4 or 5 months, there have been so many actors that have been dropped by their agencies, and so many musicians who've been, I don't know, kicked off their labels or however you say it, for standing with Palestine. And I think, yes, self-censorship is absolutely very, very real as an artist of color, I think. And I think, I can't speak for visual art, but I think like burlesque has a very specific image that people think of or that they expect to see. They expect to see like the feathers and the rhinestones and the jazzy music and stuff like that. And I think like Yes, exactly, tassels. And I think it's really exciting for me to mess with that and like have a very clear understanding of like what the audience expects when they come to a burlesque show, whether they've seen burlesque or not, and to be able to mess with that. And I think at the beginning of my burlesque career, I was like kind of tiptoeing into it. Like I would do I have nipple pasties that are just like the Palestinian flag, like fully rhinestoned, and I would just do like very classic burlesque with the feathers and the rhinestones and everything, and then take the bra off, and they would just be like Palestinian flag. So I would just like slip it in there when people wouldn't expect it. And now things have just got like my work is just like way more explicit and like way more involving these symbols of like pouring olive oil all over myself and eating watermelon on stage. And I think another thing that not just burlesque, but like nightlife, maybe a gift that nightlife artists have is anonymity, which has been something that I really, really value, that I have a stage name and a stage persona that people become familiar with, and people don't know my real name, and people don't like you would have to do a lot of digging, to like do that. And that's very rare because as a Palestinian artist, it's not hard to get banned from ever entering Palestine. And I'm lucky enough to have like a US passport, so I am able to enter certain parts of like Jerusalem and the West Bank. And that could be very, very easily taken away from me if I was performing under my real name. And yeah, and also I think like the pressures of like, what will my family think? What will my the people back home think? That's like not really something I have to deal with, because like Leila Delicious is her own person, she has her own, and now like the more that you work with this character and this like stage name and this alias, the more it becomes a separate creature from yourself, that like I can kind of jump in and out of like in my daily life, which is really exciting. And like I work at a bar, and like people have come to the bar and been like talking about the incident of Leila Delicious being banned from Taboo, and I'm behind the bar, and they don't know, they have no idea who I am, and I'm like, yes. And so it's just like a real gift that I have as a Palestinian artist to be like, that's Leila. I don't know. I think that separation is like really, really nice.
It's like you created a sense of safety
Mm-hmm.
for yourself,
Yeah.
to be able to continue creating and pushing the envelope and putting your work out there.
Yeah. And I think like the way that burlesque and drag makeup can totally change with like now what we are able to do with makeup and painting and costuming can totally change your outer appearance, which is also like a way that we can move, like nightlife artists can move throughout the world and live a total double life, which has been like just so exciting to learn as a Palestinian artist, how I can create that for myself.
So on some of the, and Kara mentioned Guernica, right, as one of the pieces, or earlier pieces of a political type painting. I was traveling in Europe this past fall as part of a German Marshall Fellowship. And one thing that I was really looking at is the role that arts play and how we create cohesive communities, right? How art can bring us closer together. And I think a part of what I saw is and learned is that the role that artists play as truth tellers, right? At the same, should be this way. I went to the Reina Sofia, which is the modern museum in Madrid, and in addition to seeing the Guernica, which for those who aren't familiar, right, is one of the earlier pieces that kind of called on the world to look at the travesty and impact of war. In another part of the museum was a Ben Shahn exhibit, who was a Jewish Lithuanian American artist who lived from late 1900s to 1969, and his 4 decades of work really covered, World War II and the rise of the early stages of civil rights movement and labor movement, early forms of discrimination during those generations. And I found it so interesting that here I was in Europe seeing this exhibit that other Europeans were looking at how America was dealing with capturing our social ills, right? And this role of truth telling, of being able to capture and document in history where we need to improve, essentially, and where people's rights are being challenged. And I just thought that was so ironic, right? Like, here I am with all of these other Europeans, and I'm thinking, I wonder what they think about us, right? And so it was just interesting to be able to sit with this idea of the role that artists can play in our society as those who are really being looked at to say the thing and to be able to evoke certain responses when there's the freedom, right, to be able to do that. So I wanted to come back to our panelists to talk about, and I think we've touched on this a lot, but in what's the role that you see as artists as being truth tellers in our democratic society that we have here, and how have you seen that show up in your own artistic practice?
Yeah. I think there's a lot of conversation around Palestinian artists right now of like what our responsibility is as truth tellers. I think like there's a big conversation about, are Palestinian artists allowed to just paint a pretty painting and just have a pretty painting that has nothing to do with the occupation and us being victims, survivors, etc. And I think it's really interesting for marginalized communities. And I think like everyone has, I think we have the right to create whatever art we want. Just put that out there. But I think when you're a part of an oppressed community, it's not even necessary. I mean, it can be about what art you're making, but it's about who you are. It's about you existing as a human being. It's the fact that you are alive and you're creating something and putting something out in the world. And like I said before, as a performance artist, it's the fact that you exist and that your body, your physical body is there on stage, especially as an intersectional person who's, Palestinian and queer. It's the fact that these two things are existing at the same time in front of you, and you can see that this exists and you cannot deny that this exists. But I think, performance has like a way of, it doesn't matter what you do. Any performance is political. A Palestinian artist could be doing ballet or the most like European whitewashed form that you could think of, and it still has significance because it is their body that is present in front of you. And I think it's interesting because the Palestinian traditional dance is a dance called debke, which has often been a way of us bringing our community together, and it's always done in like a circle, and it involves like holding hands and like stomping on the ground. And originally that was the stomping was a movement that we would use to like pound down cement when we were like creating like towns and sidewalks and stuff in Palestine. And then that movement became like an act of resistance, and like the stomping became like a symbol of resisting. And then a lot happened where this dance became illegal in Palestine, and like people performing this dance were getting arrested. And also, debke has now been appropriated by Israelis and Israeli culture, and now is also like labeled as an Israeli art form. But it's really interesting. And I have a friend, a performer in Philly named Nicole Bindler, who like has done a lot of research. You know, yeah, she's sweet. And she does like a lot of research on the appropriation of Palestinian dance, and it's really interesting to see that when you're seeing Palestinians do debke, it's still about the stomping, and the Israeli forms of debke are much more light. There is a lot of like leaping and a lot of like airy movement that's like much more lifted and much less grounded. So I think that's one example of like the truth telling was always in debke, and even when other people try to take away a dance that is uniquely ours, it's not the same. They can't do it the same way because it's not the steps, it's not the 5, 6, 7, 8, it's not the movement, it is the identity that creates the movement and that creates what you're witnessing, the groundedness of pressing your feet into your own land that is constantly being taken from you. So I just think of that as one example of like performance is truth, and it can't just be adopted by another person to mean something different. It lives on its own. It exists by itself.
Yeah, I would say it's the artwork that I create. I would say, if someone were looking at it for the first time, they probably wouldn't consider it overly political. And I'm getting back to this idea that I had this conversation a lot with my husband about how sometimes one's existence, merely just living in the world, can subvert the paradigm, right? And I think that's enough for me right now in terms of just being able to do my artwork. For me, it's like a kind of a revolutionary act. Like I recently had the first, I just got a studio, and I've been practicing art for over a decade. It's like my first studio I've ever had. And for me, it's about, because I'm a parent, taking my daughter with me and seeing that. I guess for me, that those are like kind of the small acts that I can do. When I do my work, a lot of the time I'm dealing with like sometimes they're family photographs. But I think a lot about my grandparents, and in particular my grandmothers. And I'm going off the tangent a little bit here, but like, I had one grandmother who only had a 9th grade education. She married young from West Virginia. Her grandfather was a coal miner. And on the other hand, on the other side, my grandmother had a college education when it was kind of, illegal for Black women to go to school, but she went to a historically Black college. When I do my work is I carry all that history with me. And it might not seem overt in the work that I do, but it's there, I guess. And so for me, it's all about remaining visible and just doing what I do, and because there are a lot of things to think about in my experience. Only I'm just going to speak for myself. Like why I haven't done certain types of artwork, or why I haven't shown certain types of artwork. Again, there are these multiple questions of safety. Also, one of my jobs that I say every day, because I don't know if anyone drives out here, but you know how it's reckless driving. It's great. One of the things I say to myself every day, it is my job to get home in one piece. And so, I have that commitment first, I guess, to my family. But I'm also, as we've been talking, I think I do my artwork because of my family as well. And I think there's power in being just visible.
phrase that was coming up for me as the both of you were talking is the whole is the goal. And I think that, based on both of your responses to this question of can you really separate out identity from content, from the work that we create as artists? And I think for those of us we come from marginalized backgrounds, I don't know if that's really possible if we want to remain whole. Right. And I think about my dad and his work and the pre-migration trauma that he faced, post-migration trauma, and coming to the US and trying to figure out what kind of art that he can create that is going to give him the recognition, is going to allow him to develop in his career. And his work is almost bifurcated in some sense, of that he had a Western style approach when he studied printmaking techniques. And then he had later on in his life, when he went back to contemporary Chinese painting, the intersection of both. I think people would look at his art and especially, some of his Western type pieces and say, this still looks quote unquote Oriental to me. We don't use that term. Let me just say, this is from like decades ago. And versus, looking at, and then Easterners would look at his work and say, this looks Western to me. And so I always think about how do we create a wholeness for ourselves that is true to who we are as people, regardless in what context that we're in. And like the work should flow from that, right? But I think that like that wholeness and being at peace with ourselves and our identity is so much a part of that. And it sounds like the two of you have really done that work to create that for yourselves. I have a social work background, so that's also, I'm coming into that space too of understanding trauma and the impact of trauma. And I think that's something that has to be brought into the conversation too when we're talking about censorship, right? Yeah. Any reaction to what I just shared? You don't have to, but yeah.
No, I think that's a good, just the question of when we're, as we've been talking about what censorship is it really, or one of the facets of it is it about erasing identity, someone's identity, lived experience? And to think about it in that way, it's, I don't know, really unsettling, right? Because to censor work, whether it's performance, whether it's visual performance, is to erase a human story. So there's a lot lost, I think, with the censoring part.
I think additionally, like how that impacts intergenerational trauma and how our work, whether we consider our work political or not, I think impacts that or has a conversation maybe with that intergenerational trauma. And how, as long as, as you said, as long as you're being whole and creating what exists as your truth in that moment. And in nightlife performance is really like taking up all the space in the room, really. That's all that's like asked of you, really, as a performer at like a bar nightclub setting, is really to just like live in your fullest and take up all the space in the room. I think like the conversation that can have with your intergenerational trauma and allow yourself to express express your relationship to that trauma has been really interesting.
So I think we're at the point where we want to invite you all into the conversation. Any questions that you have been percolating, or any reflections, observations? Yeah, this is the organic part of the dialogue.
I'm interested in hearing experiences too, if anyone else has had their work.
I'll go. Is that okay? Yes.
I saw you.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead. I saw another hand behind you, but you.
So I'm Sudanese, and I mean, I came directly from Sudan and diaspora, and I did my BFA in the UAE in Sharjah. And I think that must have been my first experience with censorship because at the time I was very closeted, and I was also I was the only Black student in my class, and I would remember that. I remember one of my seniors having to essentially hide her hair because there was such a thing as morality police in the UAE, especially in Sharjah, where they deem the way that you dress inappropriate if it's what they describe her hair as, which is frizzy. And there's also a lot of accent policing surrounding Sudanese diaspora in the UAE as well, which I know never really gets talked about in Arab spaces. And so I remember looking back, I remember how tense I felt at the time. And like, because of all the experiences that I had when I came to the US, and the more that I learned about what I actually had witnessed and what I experienced when I was there, it starts to become clearer because I would remember small things like your sleeves are too short, or the figures that you're making when you're painting are too close together. And I'd also remember some of my colleagues would make works. One particular colleague would make works about female anatomy and always wanted to hide them in something else. And it was never really openly discussed, but it was there in secret. And then when I came here, nearly 6-7 years later, I started to make work more about Sudanese topes and essentially becoming more political as well. Or more political, but less apolitical, if that makes sense. And I started making work about Sudanese top and what it means to me, and about the connections that women have in Sudan, what form queerness takes when it's not. I would use the word Western, but I'd rather say communal, closed, unseen, and essentially inviolate. And whenever I would make work about the Tobe here and about these relationships that the women would have, I'd always kind of get asked about where the queerness is. I want to say that I went to Micah and it's majority white, but so I'd always be left kind of having to explain myself. And essentially, literally point out and be like, they are holding each other here. This person's cleavage is slightly showing. Her colors are a little too bright, and like almost like a paint by numbers points out every instance of queerness in this image that I created for people who couldn't see it. And I was actually thinking about how instances of queerness translate within this diaspora when it's moved from my home country to this new place. And also something that I was thinking about that I never really got to question further because I never got to go back was what it would look like to take these works back, how they would be experienced there. That was a source of fear, like a lot of fear. I remember in one case, a visiting artist essentially said that my figures were too well behaved, to misquote that one quote about believe women not making history, but they should. So as opposed to what happened in the UAE, where things are a lot more, they're felt, but in a subtle way that you can't really speak out or make these things because the signs are everywhere. And this is just the way things are. Here, it was more like blow after blow of being questioned to prove myself in ways that I wasn't used to. Like, people would walk into my studio and ask, so I make work about culture because these women are dressed in tops, and yeah, lots of feelings.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for sharing.
No problem.
Yeah. Sounds like you were flipping between being full, you're not enough versus being too much. Right? In some different spaces.
Mostly not enough.
Yeah. Mhm. Yeah.
Mostly not fair.
Yeah. You are enough.
Yes.
I have a question. So, censorship not allowing people to express their opinions or beliefs or whatever. There's a lot of conversational also going on about sort of like the opposite end that are saying things that really bring a lot of violence to the front, like anti-wokeness. I may not use all the right terms or whatever, but it for you guys, like, how would you define, or like, where do you draw the line on censorship? Because, for me, like, I wouldn't want to say you shouldn't perform and talk about your culture and your struggles and your histories and things. But then there's other ideas that perhaps really would bother me, and I feel like are inciting hatred, but it's their beliefs. And so kind of where do you draw the line on censorship? I think where you don't want to trample on certain experiences, but other ones, like, it seems wrong. It's not about maybe explaining who they are. It's inciting behavior. So I don't know if that's a clear question.
No, I think that. Oh wow! So there's no easy answer. I think that depends. And having worked in a museum before, I remember some instances that where some tableaus or some figures in certain like historic, you know how you go to a museum and you see like figures oftentimes enacting something from history, or there were instances where we had to pull one of those figures because for whatever reason someone was offended by it, and I guess when you were talking, I was thinking too of like, yeah, where is the line? Because the conversation around monuments and what monuments should be dismantled or covered or destroyed. I mean, I don't know. I think it's a difficult thing because there are some, like in the United States, there are some monuments that are clearly homages to racism, and and should they be destroyed because they represent our racist past, our racist history. Personally for me, I don't think so. I think everything needs to have context. I think they can be used as teachable moments. So I don't know. I'll say it depends. I don't know. I don't know if I have an answer for that. When does censorship end? Like I don't know. That's a good one.
Yeah, I don't know that I have an answer either.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think a lot about equity in the work that I do in my day job, and I think that right now what we're seeing in these conversations, I think this is probably what you're asking about, is one side inciting violence over another. I think about voice. I think about who has freedom to have voice. And I think that it hasn't been equitable in our conversations in the United States. And that's about power and it's about oppression. Right. And so I don't know if it's necessarily we should be asking about inciting of violence, but like looking at the underlying reasons of why people do not have space to have voice. Who is trying to silence somebody else? We're here talking about censorship. So I think that's something that really has to be dismantled, is looking at who has power and why are they trying to keep it? What do they lose by not having it? So those are the root questions that I would look at. Please.
One of the places that this issue is being looked at so with great difficulty is online, is social media. How do Meta or TikTok decide what to censor and what not to censor?
Yeah.
I mean, this is a real problem that we're all confronted with right now. And I'm so cynical about politicians and what they do or don't do that it's hard to see where this is going to end up. But it's a real issue, really, the line. There's stuff that goes up on the internet that it's really horrible. I mean, to me, horrible. That does incite racism or, incense people to do violence to other people. How do we deal with that?
I don't know if I have an answer. Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Sarah.
I think what you said, Leila, about how Israel demands the definition of past, present, and future. And I feel like a lot of artists I admire right now are always talking about like how important it is to actually envision forward and to really talk tangibly, like what does a free Palestine look like? What does it look like for us to actually get free? And I feel like smarter people than me have talked about how like there are moments of the future that like we can see right now. There are these like slivers, there are these windows and vistas, whatever. So I don't know, like how do you create those futures in your own practice, or are there examples that you look to of the kinds of futures that you want?
Yeah, great question. Thanks. I think for me personally, I see the future of what a free Palestine will look like when I'm with my people and when we're like spending time together, when I'm with other queer Arabs and queer Palestinians and being together. But I think my opportunity to truly like throw it as far as I can see into the future is when I'm on stage. And I think like my goal ever since like when baby Leila was born, I think I was like, I want to have the most decadent Palestinian woman on stage eating as much as she can possibly eat, like in full indulgence. And what does that look like? Because I think like as Palestinians, we are so far from indulgence that all we can think about is just coming to a place of equal. And in my mind, a free Palestine looks like indulgence, looks like the possibility of a Palestinian performer in Palestine, like drenching themselves with like olive oil and diamonds. And there's one moment that I've performed on stage a few times where
I'm wearing like tetsuris, which is like the cross stitch. And I have a necklace that has they're not real diamonds, but like they're like rhinestones that like drape down to the bottom. And I have like a half watermelon that I have like between my legs. And I have an audience member who's always a friend of mine, like come up and eat the watermelon. And it's usually like another queer Arab person. And I think to me, I'm like, this is the image of like what a free Palestine feels like, of just like absolute total indulgence of like and I think that's why like eating on stage has like become really, really important in my work, and was before and definitely is now, as more Gazans are dying of starvation and infectious diseases than airstrikes themselves. And yeah, I just did a piece 2 days ago, like an evening length piece where I was like performing burlesque as my Palestinian grandmother, and like imagining what her burlesque would look like. And so I think that's like I try and like be like past, present, and like future, and like jump around. And I sit on stage and I get like a handful of olives and I see how many I can like fit in my mouth at the same time of just like eating and eating and eating. And so I think, yeah, blending past and future and indulgence, and reimagining past with indulgence and projecting into the future with indulgence has been like important in my work. So that's kind of how I imagine a free Palestine, and how I can kind of dance that into reality on stage as much as possible.
Thank you. Great question. Thank you. Vicky, did you want to share? No, you had raised your hand earlier.
Sure. Yeah, this is really thought-provoking. I'm not sure if my thoughts very linear. It's more like a stew. It's like a bunch of cross signals. I'm the artist in residence here, and I'm working, on some work right now. And in the series, I kind of always thought that, I kind of came to a conclusion that I wasn't really interested in really didactic political art anymore. I thought, went to a lot of art school, a lot of discussions. I didn't feel like I wanted to be instructed. I don't think, I didn't need anybody to teach me anything. If I wanted political discourse, I would go to politics, or I would go to a journal, I'd read about it, because I craved something that was articulate. I thought ambiguity was inarticulate. And then things started to happen recently. And I made a piece called, well, first off, we talk about self-censorship, I'm dealing like with imagery now that has to do with where I came from, raised in suburban Texas. So a lot of the imagery and a lot of the cultural touchstones that I traffic in are of a certain type, but yet my heritage is very different from where I was raised. And I don't know anything about that heritage. I'm half Persian, but I was raised in Houston. So it's not like I have an identity, it's like I have a void. So I traffic in using these images to talk about reconciling this void. So, kind of had a political education in school, and then I stopped trafficking in didacticism or instruction or political persuasion through art, because I thought I wanted to be the thing. I didn't want to be about the thing. Mm-hmm. I wanted to be in that place. I didn't want to strive to that place. I wanted to embody. I wanted to live my life, like making something that was beautiful, not striving to create conditions to be beautiful. I just wanted it to happen. Mm-hmm. And then things started to happen, and In my family, in my extended family, there is, there are, Israelis, and they're very opinionated. And I found myself, compelled to make some political work. And I made a piece called My Own Private Guernica, which was about coding what I felt because I didn't want to offend my family. Like, I felt compelled to make a piece about being trapped, about the feeling of not being able to escape. So I started drawing from like imagery that I was used to, pop culture, movies, that sort of thing. So I appropriated Kubrick's carpet from The Shining, the place where, if you've seen The Shining, if you read the book, in the movie, there's this carpeting, this mod carpeting, and it's throughout the entire hotel. And it's this incredible narrative about being trapped in this place you can never escape from. And I had not been compelled in so long to make anything political until I thought about people being trapped somewhere and not being able to escape, even if you wanted to run from it, even if you wanted to get the fuck away. Sorry, I'm not supposed to curse. If you wanted to get away from it, you could not get away from it. You could not get away from it. And I thought that was like the purest form of empathy I could express without being didactic. Mm-hmm. So I made this piece. But to some extent, I still felt like I self-censored because I coded so hard that it looked cool, and some collector bought it just because they thought it looked cool, and it didn't articulate what I wanted to articulate. That's all I got to say.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing your journey. Yeah. Some of the words that came up for me as you're sharing was embodiment, right? And we talked about this of like stepping fully into your identity, not aiming for it, but just embodying who we are as people. And I think we're all on this process. We're all on this journey to land where we land, and to, I don't know, I think there's got to be some element of giving grace to ourselves too, as we figure out, right? Like,
I have very little sympathy for my own endeavor.
Okay. But I appreciate what you said about wanting to own your identity and step into that. Does anybody else want to share thoughts, feedback, questions? Ash?
Yeah. Feedback. I had a question for a while. I was trying to figure out while everyone was talking and bring it down. And I think we got answers, so I want to say thank you. But the question was, I look at censorship in history and I see that it worked. I see that even our definition of art as like, we don't call women's art on purpose. There's so many times we don't like, when growing up in the 90s, that hip hop wasn't real music. Like we censored so many days, and so I wanted to be like proven wrong, but like still gotta do the thing.
Yeah. Anything anyone wants to add before we conclude?
Yeah.
Yeah. want to thank you for being in a space and thank Leila and Kara for being in conversation with us this morning. I learned a lot and I feel like I'm taking so much home with me to think about and to process through. And I hope that's true for all of you as well.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Yes.